The shelter was always cold in the early hours of dawn, no matter the season. The fluorescent lights above flickered with an eerie hum that echoed across the concrete walls. Among the rows of kennels filled with yapping and restless dogs, one figure sat quietly in the far corner, away from the gate. His name was Bruno, a large German shepherd with a faded black and tan coat. Once strong and proud but now dulled by time and pain. Bruno's eyes, a deep amber, bore the weight of many untold stories. His past was scarred with cruelty. He had once belonged to a man whose heavy hand never offered kindness. Chained outside in all seasons, he had endured beatings and hunger. Fear had become his constant companion, and any sign of human movement sent shivers through his muscular frame. The scars hidden beneath his thick fur told more than he ever could. When the man finally abandoned him on a desolate road one winter night, it was almost a relief. Bruno had survived on scraps until animal control found him, emaciated and trembling from both the cold and memories he couldn't shake. At the shelter, the workers tried to care for him, but his fear was a wall no one could break through. Each day, families came to adopt playful pups, wagging their tails with joy. But when they passed by Bruno's kennel, they either didn't notice him or looked away. His presence was like a shadow, too heavy and too sad for most people to face. He didn't bark or whine. He had learned long ago that making noise only brought punishment. Hope was something he didn't believe in anymore. "Poor boy," whispered Maria, one of the shelter volunteers, as she crouched outside his kennel one morning. She had been working there for years and had seen many dogs come and go, but Bruno's story hit her harder than most. His haunted eyes told her everything she needed to know. Despite her gentle words and offerings of treats, Bruno would barely move when she approached. He would stiffen, ears back, expecting the worst. A new volunteer entered the shelter that same day. His name was Daniel, a man in his late 30s who had once been a paramedic, but was now searching for something to heal his own broken spirit. After losing someone dear to him, Daniel had been struggling with depression, drowning in memories he couldn't shake. A friend had suggested volunteering at the shelter as a way to reconnect with life and purpose. Though skeptical, Daniel decided to give it a try. Maria greeted him warmly and gave him a tour of the facility. The dogs barked excitedly as they passed by, tails wagging and eyes full of hope. But when Daniel reached the last kennel, his eyes locked on Bruno's. For a moment, the world seemed to quiet around them. Bruno didn't move, but something in his gaze spoke to Daniel. An unspoken understanding of loss and fear. "This one's different," Maria said softly. "He's been here for months. Abused, abandoned, he's got a lot of trauma. We're not sure he'll ever trust anyone again." Daniel nodded, feeling a strange pull in his chest. "What happens if he doesn't get adopted?" Maria hesitated before answering. "Eventually, well, there's a limit to how long we can keep dogs like him. But we're trying to give him as much time as we can. He's been through enough." Daniel didn't say anything at first. He knelt down by the kennel, his heart heavy. He knew what it was like to feel trapped by the past, to carry wounds that refused to heal. He had no experience with dogs like Bruno, but something inside him wouldn't let him walk away. "I'd like to spend some time with him," Daniel said finally. Maria raised an eyebrow but agreed. The first few days were challenging. Daniel sat outside Bruno's kennel for hours, reading aloud from a book or simply talking about nothing in particular. Bruno didn't approach, but he didn't retreat either. Gradually, Daniel learned the dog's cues. How his ears twitched slightly when he was curious. How his breathing quickened when he felt threatened. Slowly, Daniel earned small victories. Bruno would sniff at the gate, and once, he even took a treat from Daniel's hand before retreating to his corner. "You're stronger than you realize, buddy," Daniel whispered one day. "You've survived this long. Maybe we both can learn how to heal." Though progress was slow, it was real. Daniel began to think about adopting Bruno, though the idea scared him. Could he really give this dog the life he deserved? What if he failed? But he couldn't bear the thought of Bruno spending the rest of his days in that cold, lonely kennel. One morning, Maria approached Daniel with paperwork. "You've been incredible with him," she said. "If you're serious about taking him home, We can start the adoption process. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Let's do it. The day Daniel brought Bruno home was filled with nervous energy. The dog paced in the back seat of the car, panting and wide-eyed, unsure of where he was going. Daniel spoke softly the entire ride, trying to calm him. When they arrived at his small house on the outskirts of town, Bruno hesitated at the door, his paws frozen on the threshold. "It's okay," Daniel said gently, kneeling beside him. "You're safe now. This is your home." Bruno eventually stepped inside, his body tense and his nose working overtime to take in every new scent. The house was quiet, warm, and filled with light. For the first time in years, Bruno wasn't confined by bars or chains. Yet he didn't know how to trust this freedom. Every noise made him flinch, and he kept close to the walls, as if afraid someone might trap him. Daniel understood. Healing would take time. Both of them had wounds that needed mending. He set out a soft bed for Bruno in the living room, leaving him space to explore at his own pace. Over the coming days, Bruno's fears would slowly begin to loosen their grip, though shadows of his past still haunted him. Small steps forward, those were victories enough for now. But unknown to both of them, a test of their growing bond would soon arise. One that would push Bruno's courage and Daniel's resolve to the brink. They would need each other more than ever before. The first night in Daniel's home was a restless one for both of them. Bruno paced the length of the living room, his claws clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Every creak of the house made him jump, his ears swiveling like radar dishes. Sleep was impossible. He didn't trust these walls yet. They were too open, too unfamiliar. Memories of his past life clung to him like a heavy fog, and the silence felt as suffocating as the chain that had once been around his neck. Daniel lay awake in his bedroom, listening to Bruno's movements. He could hear the nervous panting, the pacing that refused to stop. He knew better than to try forcing the dog to calm down. Trust had to be earned, and he wouldn't rush it. He got up quietly, walked to the living room, and sat on the floor near Bruno's bed without saying a word. The dog stopped pacing for a moment, watching him with wary eyes, then resumed his circuit around the room. "I know how you feel," Daniel finally whispered, his voice low and steady. "I couldn't sleep either when I lost her. The nights were the hardest. You feel trapped with your thoughts, like there's no escape." Bruno didn't understand the words, but he felt the calmness in Daniel's tone. After a while, he slowed his pacing and lay down at the edge of the room, his eyes half closed but still alert. Daniel stayed with him until Bruno finally drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. Over the following weeks, small victories marked their progress. Bruno learned that the kitchen was a place where good things happened, like treats and warm food. He started to follow Daniel at a cautious distance, his curiosity gradually overriding his fear. He even began to approach Daniel when he sat quietly on the couch, though any sudden movement would still send him retreating to a corner. Daniel noticed every tiny sign of trust. The first time Bruno let him pet his head without flinching, Daniel felt a surge of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The daily walks were a challenge at first. The outside world was full of triggers for Bruno. Passing cars, distant shouting, even the rustling of leaves in the wind. He would freeze, his body stiff with fear, and Daniel had to patiently coax him forward. Sometimes, Bruno would pull in a panic, his eyes wild, as if expecting some unseen danger to leap out at him. Daniel never scolded him, instead speaking softly and giving him time to settle. One afternoon, something shifted. They were walking along a quiet path near the park when a young girl on a bicycle rode by. Bruno tensed but didn't panic. Instead, he watched the girl with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Daniel noticed and praised him gently. "See? Not everything out here wants to hurt you," Daniel said, giving Bruno a small treat. The shepherd hesitated before taking it, but there was a hint of trust in his eyes. Despite these steps forward, Bruno's past still haunted him in ways Daniel couldn't fully understand. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, a sudden noise shattered the calm. A loud bang from outside, like the crack of something heavy falling. It was harmless, likely a garbage bin tipping over in the wind, but to Bruno it was a trigger. His body went rigid, his ears flattened, and he bolted for the bedroom, knocking over a lamp in his panic. "Bruno, it's okay," Daniel called after him, his voice steady but concerned. He found the dog hiding under the bed, trembling uncontrollably. Daniel sat on the floor nearby and waited. Minutes passed in silence before Bruno's trembling began to subside. Slowly, Daniel reached a hand toward him, palm open and unthreatening. Bruno sniffed it cautiously, then rested his muzzle against Daniel's hand. It was a moment of vulnerability and trust that neither of them had experienced in a long time. "It's okay," Daniel whispered again. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." They stayed like that for a long time, Daniel gently stroking Bruno's fur as the dog finally relaxed. The bond between them deepened with each shared moment of understanding. But the peace they were building together would soon be tested by a danger neither of them had anticipated. One night, while Daniel was away at the store, Bruno found himself alone in the house. The familiar quiet returned, but this time it was different. There was something wrong. His ears perked up as he heard faint footsteps outside the front door. A low growl rumbled in his throat. The door handle rattled. Bruno's hackles rose, fear and instinct surging through him. He moved toward the door, his growl growing louder. The figure on the other side hesitated, then tried the handle again. Bruno barked, a deep, powerful warning that echoed through the house. The intruder didn't expect resistance. Startled by the sudden noise, they fled into the night. Bruno stayed by the door, his body tense and protective, until Daniel returned. When Daniel entered and saw Bruno standing guard, he immediately sensed something had happened. Bruno's posture was alert but not panicked. Daniel checked the door and found signs of tampering. Someone had tried to break in. "Good boy," Daniel said softly, kneeling beside him. "You protected our home." For the first time, Bruno seemed to stand a little taller. The fear that had once defined him was beginning to transform into something stronger: courage. That night, Daniel and Bruno sat together on the porch, the stars shining brightly overhead. The tension had passed, but their bond had grown even stronger. Bruno leaned against Daniel's side, a rare moment of complete trust. In that quiet, peaceful night, they both felt something new blooming within them. A sense of belonging, of safety, and of hope. But there were still more challenges ahead. Trust was a fragile thing, and Bruno's journey wasn't over yet. They had come far, but the shadows of the past hadn't fully released their hold. Together, they would face whatever came next, step by step. Life settled into a comforting rhythm for Daniel and Bruno. Each day brought small moments of progress. Bruno was learning that the world wasn't always a threat. He began exploring the backyard, sniffing at flowers and chasing leaves caught in the wind. At home, he would occasionally bring a toy to Daniel, a sign that he was slowly embracing play again. It was as if pieces of the dog he had once been were being carefully pieced back together. Daniel, too, was healing in his own way. He found purpose in caring for Bruno. The quiet companionship helped ease the pain of his own loss. Yet, both of them knew that the shadows of their past still lingered. They had made progress, but trust was a delicate thing, easily shaken by the ghosts that refused to let go. One afternoon, while they were on their usual walk near the park, Bruno suddenly froze. His ears pinned back, and his tail lowered as he stared ahead. Daniel followed his gaze and saw a man walking on the opposite side of the street. The man was tall, with a rough, unshaven face and heavy boots that clattered on the pavement. Something about him triggered a deep fear in Bruno. The shepherd let out a low, trembling growl and backed up, his body language screaming panic. "Easy, Bruno," Daniel said gently, crouching beside him. "It's okay. He's just a stranger." But Bruno wasn't convinced. His eyes remained fixed on the man, who glanced their way with a dismissive look before continuing on. Daniel's heart ached at the sight of Bruno's fear. It was clear that the man's appearance had dredged up memories of someone from Bruno's past, perhaps the person who had hurt him. Even long after the man disappeared from sight, Bruno remained tense and anxious. When they returned home, Bruno paced the living room, unable to settle down. Daniel tried to comfort him with soft words and gentle petting, but the dog was restless, as if the old fears had found a way to claw their way back to the surface. The following days were difficult. Bruno became more skittish, reverting to some of his old behaviors. He flinched at sudden noises and avoided strangers on their walks. It was disheartening for Daniel to see, but he refused to give up. He knew trauma wasn't something that could be erased overnight. Healing wasn't a straight line. To help Bruno regain his confidence, Daniel decided to change up their routine. Instead of walking through the park where the triggering encounter had occurred, they explored quieter paths near a wooded area. The calm surroundings seemed to help. Slowly, Bruno began to relax again, though his trust in unfamiliar places remained fragile. One day, as they walked along a peaceful trail, Bruno suddenly perked up. His nose twitched as he caught a scent in the breeze. Without warning, he bolted forward, his leash slipping from Daniel's grasp. Daniel called after him, fear rising in his chest.
Bruno.
Stop! The shepherd didn't stop. His instincts had taken over. Daniel sprinted after him, his heart pounding. Bruno disappeared around a bend in the trail, and Daniel cursed under his breath, praying that nothing bad would happen. When he finally caught up, he found Bruno standing still, nose pressed to the ground. In front of them was an abandoned shack, hidden by trees and overgrown weeds. It was old, weathered, and eerily quiet. Bruno sniffed around the area, his body tense but not panicked. Daniel approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the structure. "What is it, buddy?" Daniel asked, catching his breath. "What's got you so worked up?" Bruno let out a low whine and pawed at the ground near the entrance of the shack. Daniel hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The interior was dark, with broken furniture and shattered glass scattered across the floor. It looked like no one had been there in years. Yet something about the place felt wrong. Bruno stood at the doorway, his eyes wary but focused. Daniel noticed deep scratch marks on the walls. Marks that looked like they had been made by claws. He shivered, a chill running down his spine. Whatever had happened here was long in the past, but it had clearly left its mark. "Come on, Bruno," Daniel said, gently tugging on the leash. "Let's get out of here." Bruno hesitated but eventually followed, casting one last glance at the shack before they walked away. The encounter left both of them unsettled. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the shack symbolized something, a place of fear and abandonment that echoed Bruno's own history. Perhaps Bruno had sensed it too. That night, the nightmares returned for both of them. Daniel woke in a cold sweat, haunted by dreams of losing Bruno to some unseen danger. He found the dog curled up in the corner of the room, his body trembling as if caught in his own nightmare. Daniel knelt beside him, stroking his fur gently. "It's okay," he whispered. "We're both safe now. I won't let anything hurt you." Bruno slowly calmed under Daniel's touch. In that moment, Daniel realized just how deep their connection had grown. They were both survivors, haunted by their pasts but determined to move forward together. Whatever darkness still lurked in the corners of their minds, they would face it side by side. But the trials they had faced so far were only a prelude to the greatest test yet. A threat that would soon come knocking on their door, forcing them to confront their fears head-on. Trust, courage, and love would be their only weapons against it. The days passed quietly at first, though the tension still lingered in subtle ways. Bruno would sometimes stop and stare at the front door as if expecting something, or someone. Daniel noticed it but tried not to dwell on it. He didn't want to feed into the fear that had taken hold of both of them. Instead, he focused on their daily routine, reinforcing positive moments and helping Bruno regain a sense of safety. But fate had other plans. It was a late evening when the peace they had carefully built was shattered. Daniel had just finished tidying up the kitchen when Bruno's ears perked up. A low growl rumbled from his throat as he moved toward the window. Daniel frowned and followed, peering outside. First, he saw nothing. The street was dark and quiet, illuminated only by the pale glow of streetlights. But then he noticed a figure standing across the street near the trees, watching. The figure didn't move for several moments, and an eerie tension settled over the scene. Bruno's growl deepened, his body stiff and protective. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. He wasn't sure if it was paranoia or a real threat, but something about the figure unsettled him. He stepped away from the window, trying to remain calm. "It's probably nothing," he murmured to himself, though he wasn't entirely convinced. Bruno didn't seem convinced either. He continued to stare at the window, his muscles tense and ready for action. A few minutes later, Daniel heard a noise outside, a faint scratching sound, like someone testing the locks. His stomach tightened with fear. This wasn't paranoia. Someone was trying to break in. Daniel quickly grabbed his phone and turned off the lights, hoping to stay unnoticed. Bruno moved to the front door, his hackles raised, ready to defend his territory. Daniel could see the dog's transformation. Fear was no longer in control. Bruno wasn't the broken, trembling dog he had once been. He was standing his ground. The door handle jiggled, and Daniel's fear intensified. Without thinking, he called out loudly, "Who's there? I'm calling the police." For a moment, everything went silent. Then, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed outside as the intruder fled into the night. Daniel exhaled a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he locked the door more securely. Bruno remained by his side, vigilant and alert, until the sounds outside faded completely. "Good boy," Daniel whispered, kneeling down to pet Bruno. The dog's body slowly relaxed under his touch, though his eyes still scanned the room, making sure the danger was gone. Daniel knew they had narrowly avoided a serious threat. It wasn't just a random act. Whoever had tried to break in had been watching them, waiting for the right moment. He couldn't shake the image of the figure standing in the shadows outside. Had it been the same man they'd encountered on the street that day? The thought made his skin crawl. The next day, Daniel reported the incident to the local authorities. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but Daniel wasn't satisfied. He decided to take extra precautions, installing security cameras and reinforced locks on the doors and windows. He refused to let fear take over their lives again. Bruno sensed the tension but adapted quickly to the new routine. Daniel spent more time training him, reinforcing commands that would help keep them both safe. The bond between them deepened further. Bruno began to trust his own instincts, and Daniel learned to trust Bruno's. One evening, while reviewing the footage from the security cameras, Daniel noticed something unsettling. The same figure from before appeared in the recordings, standing near the edge of the property. They didn't approach the house this time, but their presence was enough to send a chill down Daniel's spine. Whoever this was, they weren't giving up easily. "Who are you?" Daniel muttered under his breath. He felt a surge of anger. He had worked too hard to rebuild a life of peace for both himself and Bruno. He wasn't going to let some stranger take that away. As the days went by, Daniel and Bruno remained on high alert. They were no longer just survivors, they were protectors of each other. Every evening, Daniel would sit on the porch with Bruno by his side, keeping watch over their small corner of the world. The quiet companionship between them was a source of strength. The final confrontation came on a stormy night. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and rain lashed against the windows. Daniel was reading on the couch while Bruno lay at his feet, his eyes half closed but still alert. The atmosphere was tense but calm, until Bruno suddenly shot to his feet, growling fiercely. Daniel's heart pounded. "What is it, Bruno?" The dog sprinted to the front door, barking loudly. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached. Through the window, he saw movement, a shadowy figure trying to hide near the side of the house. "Hey!" Daniel shouted, throwing open the door. Rain drenched him instantly as he stepped outside. Bruno followed, his barking echoing through the storm. The intruder hesitated but then bolted toward the trees. Daniel didn't pursue, knowing it wasn't safe. Instead, he stayed near the house, flashlight sweeping across the yard. Bruno stood beside him, soaked but unyielding, his presence a powerful deterrent. After a few tense moments, the night fell silent again, save for the pounding rain. Daniel knew they had driven the threat away for now. When they finally retreated inside, Daniel knelt down beside Bruno, his hand resting on the dog's soaked fur. "You did it, Bruno. You protected us." Bruno leaned into Daniel's touch, a sign of complete trust and understanding. They had faced their fears together and come out stronger. That night, as the storm faded, both man and dog slept soundly for the first time in what felt like ages. The shadows of the past had been confronted and pushed back. Trust had been earned not just between them but within themselves. The long road of healing wasn't over, but they knew one thing for certain. Together, they could face whatever came next. The next morning dawned bright and calm, as though the storm had washed away the fear and tension of the previous night. Sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the wooden floors. Daniel woke feeling more rested than he had in months. For once, there were no nightmares. He stretched and glanced toward the living room, where Bruno lay peacefully on his bed. The dog's chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, his face relaxed and free from the usual tension. Bruno stirred when he noticed Daniel approaching and wagged his tail, a small but meaningful gesture that had become more frequent in recent days. Daniel smiled warmly and crouched beside him, scratching behind his ears. "Good morning, buddy," Daniel said softly. "You slept well, huh? You earned it." Bruno huffed contentedly, leaning into the affection. It was a far cry from the scared, distrustful dog Daniel had brought home weeks ago. Each small victory, every wag, every moment of trust, was a testament to their shared resilience. After breakfast, Daniel decided to take Bruno for a walk along their favorite wooded trail. The air was fresh and cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Birds chirped in the trees, and the world seemed alive with new possibilities. Bruno trotted confidently at Daniel's side, ears perked and eyes alert, but no longer filled with fear. They reached a clearing where a small creek babbled gently over smooth stones. Daniel sat on a large rock near the water's edge, watching as Bruno explored the area. The shepherd sniffed at the creek, dipped a paw into the cool water, and then turned to look at Daniel with an expression that almost seemed playful. "Go ahead," Daniel encouraged with a chuckle. "Have some fun." Bruno hesitated for a moment, as if the concept of play was still unfamiliar. But then he splashed into the shallow water, pawing at the ripples and chasing them like a puppy. Daniel laughed, feeling a lightness in his chest that had been absent for so long. It wasn't just Bruno who was healing. Daniel was too. They were both learning to let go of the past and embrace the present. Later that afternoon, Maria from the shelter came to visit. She had heard about the attempted break-in and wanted to check on them. When she arrived, Bruno greeted her at the door, not with fear, but with cautious curiosity. He sniffed her hand and eventually allowed her to pet him, a clear sign of how far he had come. "Wow," Maria said, smiling as she scratched Bruno's ears. "I can't believe how different he is. You've done an amazing job with him, Daniel." "It wasn't just me," Daniel replied, glancing at Bruno with affection. "We helped each other." Maria nodded knowingly. "Dogs like Bruno, they're special. They teach us things about resilience and trust that we might not learn otherwise. I'm really proud of both of you." Bruno wagged his tail again, clearly enjoying the praise. Maria stayed for a while, sharing stories of other shelter dogs who had found their forever homes. For the first time, Daniel felt a sense of belonging, not just to his home but to a community of people who understood the power of compassion and second chances. In the weeks that followed, Daniel and Bruno continued to thrive. They met more neighbors on their walks, and Bruno grew more comfortable around people. One day, a young boy approached them cautiously, asking if he could pet Bruno. Daniel knelt beside the dog, reassuring him with a gentle hand on his back. "It's okay, Bruno," Daniel said softly. "You're safe. He just wants to say hi." Bruno hesitated but eventually sniffed the boy's hand. When the boy gently stroked his fur, Bruno's tail wagged slowly. It was a powerful moment, proof that trust, though fragile, could be rebuilt with time and patience. The boy beamed. "He's really nice. What's his name?" "Bruno," Daniel replied, smiling. He's a pretty special dog. As they continued their walk, Daniel reflected on how far they had come. The dark days of fear and isolation felt like distant memories. They had faced the shadows of their pasts and emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson, Daniel and Bruno sat together on the porch, watching the world slowly fade into twilight. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, and the air was filled with the peaceful hum of crickets. Bruno rested his head on Daniel's knee, his eyes half closed in contentment. "You know," Daniel said quietly, running his hand through Bruno's soft fur, "I think we were meant to find each other. Maybe all the pain we went through brought us here, to this moment." Bruno let out a gentle sigh, as if agreeing. The weight of the past no longer pressed down on them. They had found a new beginning, a life built on trust, love, and hope. Daniel stared out at the horizon, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they could face them together. For the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. And for Bruno, the dog who had once been lost and broken, it was a future filled with warmth, safety, and unconditional love. In the glow of the setting sun, two survivors sat side by side, no longer haunted by their pasts but empowered by their journey. Together, they had overcome adversity, and together, they would continue to heal. The shadows had finally lifted, leaving room for light to fill their hearts.